I just found out I was shaddily cut out from a multi-million-dollar inheritance by a wicked step-aunt. What kind of drama could you have just lived without knowing? My dad inherited almost $250,000 back in the 80s. A lot of it supposedly went into a college account for me. Said account disappeared, and my mom has no idea what happened to the money. So, dude, I feel ya. When I was a kid I had rabbits. My mom never let me keep them in the house because she was allergic. So they lived in a small hutch in the backyard underneath the veranda. One day I went to go check on the bunnies and they weren't there. I asked what happened to them and my father said that they must have ran away. A pretty thin explanation, but it was good enough for my 5-year-old brain. I was perfectly fine with this reality until what actually happened was finally revealed to me nearly 20 years later. My uncle had ate them. He was feeling like rabbit stew, so he went into the hutch, took the bunnies, killed them and ate them. My parents knew the truth the whole time. That my girlfriend cheated on me when I went off to college with a good friend, and none of my close friends who knew about it ever told me. They would literally flirt in front of everyone during lunch hours, and no one bothered to tell me about the it they were doing. You realize when you're out of high school and looking into it, that a metric duck ton of it happens that you wouldn't even notice if you were in it. When I was born, my parents were given a grant for my education by my father's boss. When it matured, it was supposed to be worth $25,000. After my parents split up, my father and his ex-fiancée decided to cash it in early and use the money to pay for their wedding, which I wasn't allowed to attend. I was 6. Edit. Missed the double E in fiancée. I have a half-sister that I never met or even knew I had until I was in college. Apparently she got mixed up in the wrong crowd as a teenager, got mixed up in drugs, alcohol and ended up pregnant by someone she didn't even know. My father, instead of being supportive, went off on her and gave the whole follow my rules in my house or get out speech. She called his bluff and left. Nobody knows where she went or ended up. My dad has never mentioned it to me. My mom told me about it. Apparently he's had people look for her to no avail. The fall before I moved out for college, my parents redid their kitchen. Long before I'd been accepted to any university, let alone any scholarships. I learned only after I got $140K in scholarships I could only have hoped for in the fall that my parents took out more than 30% of my college money to pay for their kitchen. I wouldn't have been able to afford college without those scholarships. 3 different mothers until I was about 8 years old. Yes, I lived in a polygamous household, and it was nothing but vomit-inducing drama between my mother and the other 2. Politics shot back and forth between my dad and them, and even poor co-parenting from other mothers taking care of all the kids. My other mom, Sherry, would purposely exclude me from hanging out with her kids even though we were good friends. God knows how many days I spent outside by myself wondering why I wasn't good enough to play with my half-siblings. My grandma has Alzheimer's, and for the last 2 years she's lived with my family, and 3 years prior we had to check on her daily at her house to be sure she wasn't dead. Remember her to eat, take meds etc. Turns out my aunt, grandma's daughter, dad's sister, had promised to move out to where we lived to take care of her. At the last minute she backed out because she didn't want to move. She also took a $10,000 loan from grandma to buy her son a new car because he wrecked his first one that grandma bought him. It's been 3 years and there's no sign of the loan. Grandma thinks my aunt is the hardest working woman in the world and regularly cries because her only daughter works so hard. Also, my aunt implies via Facebook that my parents are taking all my grandma's money and not taking care of her. Like, would be better if we never knew her at all. I cannot think of anything positive that has come from her. When my older sister was a toddler, she fell off of a balcony. My parents sued the landlord and got a hefty settlement, around $63,000. They put it away in a trust fund for her. Fast forward to 2 years ago, my mom abandoned my sister and me with my dad and his wife. Dad and sis talk about the trust fund and decide to access it so that she'll have a cushion while she tried to figure out what to do with her life. They find out that the account was placed under my mother's name, but with her father's last name, different from ours. After jumping through hurdles to get it into her name, she finds out that there's $11,000 left. She was extremely hurt that our mom stole from her. Long before I was around, my great-grandparents bought a family plan, or whatever the term is, in the historic cemetery in the small community where they lived. There was room for 6 people, themselves, their 2 sons, and their 2 sons' wives. The older brother, my great-uncle, was twice divorced, and neither ex-wife made it into the family plot for whatever reasons. When his 3rd wife died, she was buried in the spot originally reserved for his spouse, and all was good. The younger brother, my grandfather, was the next to go, and he was put in his spot. Then the older brother's girlfriend died. They were in their late 70s or maybe early 80s at this point and had known each other for less than a year. So naturally he had her buried in my grandmother's spot. He went in himself not long after that, and my grandmother passed. Not only was the spot next to her husband taken, but we weren't even able to get another spot somewhere else in the cemetery. Small historic community cemetery. So not only are my loving and dedicated grandparents not buried next to each other, they're not even in the same county because my dirtbag great uncle decided his sunset fling was more deserving. I had a friend who was an exchange student from Brazil. I didn't meet him until like halfway through the year. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. We're having his last night in America dinner. Then he tells me about this Brazilian girl exchange student. Then shows me a picture. And Godman, she was a perfect 10. Like, if I could have ducked her, the first person to pull me away would be the King of England. Then my friend says, oh yeah, she totally thinks you are hot sexy American. Me, what? Are you serious? Him, oh yes. She does tell me. Me, well, call her and tell her to come over. Now. Him, oh, I cannot. She has already go back to Brazil. I cried for days. Why it is possible for living relatives to fight over a will is beyond me. I'd assume that if a will is written but proper, impartial witness, as far as that is possible, with an attorney present should not be refutable by anyone still alive. Tough luck if you don't agree. It's not your ducking call. Sigh. Money makes some people act like the most entitled cunts ever seen. It's unreal. Man's dead. His last living wish? Ignore IT. I want monies. Ian Albert, a hobbyist genealogical researcher, so I've seen my fair share of probate files. Research time. Find out where the will was probated. Get the entire probate file. Read. Ponder. An injunction doesn't really make sense. It's entirely possible that the funds were not disbursed and that the reason given was that you were underage. In which case they should have appointed you a guardian ad litem who should have administered your portion of the estate. If great auntie appointed herself, she may well have plundered it. In which case you would have a cause of action against her or the estate. If the will was actually broken, which is fairly rare, and my granddad and siblings broke my great aunt's will for relatively good cause, then you are pretty well ducked. TLDR. Get the entire probate file and read it. Not sure if this counts as drama, but I definitely would rather have not known. I applied for a scholarship last semester that I didn't think I would get. One day I get a call warning me that they accidentally sent everyone who applied an email saying that they got the scholarship even though the real winners hadn't been decided yet. They told me that the decision would be made soon and that those who received the scholarship would be informed via email at the beginning of the following month. Well, I checked my email that next month, once during the first week and a second time during the second week, but I didn't have any news on the scholarship. I figured I just hadn't gotten it and stopped checking my school email account. Well, here I am 4 months later clearing out that inbox and I find several emails saying last chance to accept your scholarship and whatnot. Turns out they had sent me the email to tell me I had received the scholarship only a few days after the last time I checked my email. Granted, the scholarship wasn't that huge. It's only for 1 year, and I can always apply again next year. But still, who knows if I'll be lucky enough to pull that off a second time. I'm still kind of pissed that they didn't send me a letter in the mail or call me or anything at all other than the email. But I have no one to blame but myself for not keeping up with my school email. I just wish I had never noticed those messages when I emptied my inbox. Ouch. I would probably be inclined to confront her about that. Here's mine. The guy I had a crush on since middle school recently admitted that he's always had feelings for me. I told him I liked him a couple of times and apparently he was just too socially awkward to tell me that he felt the same way. I always thought that he only liked me as a friend. Anyway, It makes no difference because I'm in a 3-year relationship with a man who lives on the other side of the country and we're talking about marriage. I'm happy. It's just kind of annoying that he never told me even though I gave him ample opportunities to say so. And I can't help but wonder what might have been, even if it was just 6. That my grandfather's partner probably killed him to try to take his money. First off, he lives half the country away from us, so we don't see him often. When we do, he's pretty weak, not like old man weak, because he used to build houses, so now he's just slightly below average strength. We also meet his friend who works for him as a live-in nurse, but he makes it fairly clear that he doesn't need any nursing. One day my mom gets the call that he died out on the lake, and changed his will around right beforehand, so that this woman is the overseer of his estate. 3 reasons this is suspicious. He was too weak when we last saw him to move his boat to the lake to go fishing. This woman had been spending his money as long as she knew him, but we were okay with it, and it seemed he was too, because he needed some company, and we hadn't been able to visit him often. He'd never mentioned anything about changing the overseer of the estate to us, and we had actually made plans assuming it would be left up to my mother, as our immediate family were literally his only living relatives not in prison. I hope that whore was upset as duck when she realized that the only thing she would be able to take was a couple of boxes of Playboy magazines and some whiskey. Do you plan on doing something about this? 2 things. 1. Found out my mom is on her 2nd marriage when I was 15. Only reason she told me is I started swimming with one of her first husband's kids by a 2nd wife. 2. Found out my great aunt was trying to swindle my grandmother out of a portion of the proceeds from the sale of her house. Great aunt suggested a particular real estate agent that she knew. My dad read the closing papers on the house very carefully and found out that 20% of the sale value was set to go to my great aunt as some sort of procurement fee. To be clear, it was a family farm, and my great aunt had lived in the house as a child, but gave up all rights and inheritances to the property when she decided to move out of state around 40 years ago. Since then, my grandmother and her husband, RIP, had cared for the house and the property it stood on, raised their 5 children there, and called it home until 2011, when it was sold after a protracted decision-making process regarding whether my grandmother could afford handle maintaining a farmstead with no one living on it. Thankfully, my dad read the closing papers closely enough to find this clause and cut it out before handing it over to a different realtor to process the sale, close the deal. It sparked a huge feud between my grandmother's children and my great aunt, and, to a lesser degree, my great aunt's children. That both of my parents had been married previously, that there were no kids from either marriage, and that my mother's ex is the brother of her brother-in-law, aka her sister's husband. Had I been born into that family, my cousins and I would have come from the same gene pool. My stepmother got my now deceased father to cut his kids out of his will. He had a massive stroke, and the year to follow he suffered several more, leaving him, not the same person. Months before he died, she scheduled to sell one of his cars, a 73 Lotus Europa, on Pawn Stars. She is an evil cunt and I wish to see her suffer for taking advantage of my dad. I also miss him very much. After my grandmother passed away, my aunt had some of her ashes put into a tattoo. My grandmother didn't like tattoos. My grandmother also told this same aunt that she wanted to be buried because she was Catholic. My aunt decided not to tell anyone else and push the cremation so that she could keep the ashes with her. She told me this the day after my grandma was cremated while I was driving her from Pennsylvania to New Hampshire because she didn't want to drive so far. I could have done with the news of my bio father. Note, my bio father is an ex-Marine, Vietnam vet, 2 tours, and batted crazy. Thankfully my stepdad is awesome and raised me as his own without a bat of the eye. But the bio dad is stone cold nuts. I actually thank my mom for hightailing it out of that creepy relationship. I think I would have been better off not knowing anything about him. We had a family friend who was quite wealthy. She was single and her only son had died in Vietnam. She liked me and my name was the same as her son's, and she had no one to give her money to. She wanted to leave it to me to help with college and whatnot. My stepfather refused, saying he wanted me to grow up struggling. WTF when I found out, I broke all contact with him forever. My parents got divorced when I was about 9 years old. He was, by all accounts, a hell of a party animal, but he wasn't much of a father. Sidebar, I'll always remember him arriving home one night after totaling his car, and he was so it-faced that he passed out in a corner of our house while still standing. Watching your father standing and snoring at the same time is an interesting sight to behold at 9 years of age. The stipulations of the divorce gave my mother sole custody of me, and dictated that in addition to child support payments, my father would have to maintain a $50,000 life insurance policy until I was 30 years old, with me as the sole beneficiary. Skip forward 12 years. My dad contracts emphysema and dies. His new wife informs us afterward that he cancelled the policy a few years after the divorce. I get nothing other than some old Navy uniforms and a cheap watch. TL. Doctor parents split. Dad reneges on life insurance deal. I still have college debt. My grandparents are immigrants from India that started various orchards and farmlands when moving here. Various members of the family shared and worked on these and had built up quite an empire. When his father was dying, his uncle, the dying father's brother, tricked him into signing a bunch of documents that gave him sole ownership of all the orchards. After he passed, he kicked my grandpa out of his home. My father was a little kid at the time. My grandpa took out loans and bought his own orchard and worked his way back up. All of his kids are highly educated and successful. The evil uncle's kids on the other hand are spoiled drug addicts. Even knowing this, I still get mad that I could have been a spoiled trust fund kid more than less than. I have two insane, badass, intelligent, high dysfunctional parents. They used to be wild party animals. This was before I came around. I've heard a few stories but only one makes me cringe. My older brother told me that during one of my parents' many drunk rampages, my dad made my mom eat her own fresh stink. I try not to think about it. Not me, but a friend of mine went to college for years, racking up a crap ton in student loan debt only to find out afterwards that a trust fund existed to pay for all his college expenses. He was adopted, and his parents got divorced when he was a kid. He stayed with his mom, but his adoptive grandfather on his dad's side set up a trust fund to cover the cost of college for all his grandkids. Thankfully, when he found out about it, he managed to get the fund to cover all his student loans. I could have gone without knowing my dad wanted me aborted. Also, that the first time he held me he said this one's gonna be rich. But hey, he was right. I would not exist if an abortion didn't cost so much. Knowing I was an accident. Found out at Thanksgiving when I was 17 that my ex had been banging a guy for months when we broke up. Learning this 5 years after the fact didn't help me at all. My girlfriend moved across the country after breaking up with me. We lived together at the time. She never gave a reason why but did let me know 2 weeks after moving to the other coast that she cheated on me every time I went to work. I just found out a few days ago why my best friend in 5th-9th grade suddenly became so busy. One of my first really good friends. We got along fabulously, shared tons of interests, and generally had a blast together. We used to hang out all the time. I never really stopped to wonder why my friend was busy all the time, and why that was such an abrupt change. As it happened, we shared a sport, and so we were carpooling for a while. My parents chose to stop that after a bit, saying I was really busy, which I was, and it would save time, which it would. The part no one ever told me was that on more than one occasion my parents had noticed that one of my friend's parents smelled strongly of alcohol. This was the parent that drove us most days, and my parents decided that saving a few minutes and some gas just wasn't worth worrying about my safety. They told her that we needed to save time and then cut off the carpool. Apparently she later cornered them in the parking lot and full on screamed at them for making unjust accusations. From then on, my friend was very busy. I miss hanging out a lot. Maybe it'll be different when we have licenses. I hope so. Last year, I found out the reason my grandparents lived apart for my entire lifetime but never got divorced is because my grandmother has been carrying on an affair with her married business partner for the better part of 30 years. The guy's wife and my, now deceased, grandfather both knew and agreed to turn the other cheek, as long as the guy and my grandmother didn't divorce them. I used to play the same lottery numbers for years and won quick pick, random. Didn't play for a few years. Played, check the numbers on teletext, Ireland. If I'd played the week before I'd have won something like 100,000. Shared prize. The second prize as such. Didn't remember until I saw this post. Never check the numbers now if I play. Just get the ticket scanned : As a short backstory, my sisters and brother are from a different marriage. We have the same father, but a different mother. My sister took graduation pictures at my graduation and didn't send them right away to my mom. So my mom vented to me one day saying I saved them from their evil mother who wanted to drive them off a cliff and commit suicide. And this is how she treats me? There is no response to that question. My mom cheated on my dad with her boss once. When I was young, my dad told me when he was drunk one night. I will never unlearn that. Well, I would guess it's because in your state, the husband's assets automatically go to his wife. I think in some states, you need extraordinary circumstances to prevent your spouse from taking everything from you after you die, since the logic is that you two build those assets together. I always knew my mom was adopted, but I recently found out that when she was 6 or so her mother straight up abandoned her and her sister and brother. Left them in an apartment because she found some rich man or something who didn't want to have anything to do with kids. Poor Mom D. 2 years ago, when I graduated high school, I got a laptop from my mom and grandparents as a combination birthday Christmas graduation present and I was ecstatic. I find out a few months later that my younger cousin and her parents were pissed at my grandparents because they were under the impression that they bought me a laptop for the hell of it, when my mom actually paid for most of it. They then proceed to ignore most of my family and cause drama that, to this day, is not completely sorted out. They didn't come to any family gatherings for almost a year and a half. This all could have been avoided if they had just done that adult thing and talked to my grandparents about it. Oh duck, that hurts deep. I would brood forever on that. My parents had 6 in order for my existence. I could have lived a full, happy life without ever knowing this. And my grandma on my father's side died. I was devastated. A few weeks later one of my uncles called and wanted to know if I could give him a number so that he could buy a new Ford at a lower cost since my dad had retired from there before he had died. I called Ford and got him a discount number and he decked out F-150. A few weeks later an aunt called and wanted me to do the same. I got her the discount and she bought a F-150 as well. This continued on because me dad had 13 brothers and sisters. Most retired and bought motorhomes and started traveling, and I couldn't figure out why since most were broke all my life and most had welfare. Finally a cousin told me how we got ducked out of our share of my grandma's money since we lived out of state. I contacted a lawyer and he wanted quite a bit because they all spent the money and recovering money would be near impossible. That's family for you. Similar story. My great-grandmother was conned by my great-grandfather's stepbrother and lost her incredibly lucrative business in the early 1900s. We still have letters of my great-grandfather sending money over to Europe for my great-grandmother to buy land and real estate. It was usually in sums of $9,000. I believe that was a lot of money back then. TLDR. My family could have been filthy rich. My mother stole money from my siblings and I after our father died. My mother and grandmother stopped talking to each other about a decade ago. I wasn't old enough to see a problem at the time, but my mother, who I'll admit may be a little biased on the matter, tells me stories of when she was growing up that paints a very unfavorable view on my grandmother. Her biggest issue was her need to be in absolute control, all the time, over everyone. Eventually an argument over religion. My mom wanted to return to active Jewish observance, which was something my grandmother would hear nothing of, was the straw that broke the camel's back, and all contact was ended between my mother and the rest of her family, most of whom sided with my grandmother out of fear for what she might do to them. They were so estranged that when my grandmother died a couple of years ago we didn't even learn of it until a couple months later when a family friend talked about it and expected us to know. Really, I could go for ages on the stories and drama that occurred on my mom's side of the family. They are a particularly dysfunctional group of people. 5 million at 18 would almost certainly have ruined you. Emo.